and the camera for the event recording, which will be on our website, will be focused on the stage, so your face will not be seen. If you do ask a question, it might pick up the audio. And with that, I will turn it over to David, who will be moderating the session today. Thanks.
Hello, how are you? We're here today to have an interesting discussion with a couple of gentlemen that I've gotten to know over the last year or so. I think they have some interesting insights into things that I think are on the cusp or the leading edge of finance, economics, financial engineering, in terms of how to think about markets and how markets function. Have with us this evening Alan King, research staff member with the Mathematical Science Department at IBM Watson Research Center. And you've been there since 1988, I understand, Alan? And focuses on optimization and decision-making under uncertainty, two areas that are near and dear to my heart. And has been doing a lot of work, interesting work, on modeling networks using agent-based modeling and some other techniques. Beside Alan, we have Duncan Watts, who's principal research scientist at Yahoo, focusing on human social dynamics. He runs that group. He's also an adjunct research fellow at Columbia University and an external faculty member of the Santa Fe Institute, which is how I got to know Duncan, and also an external faculty member in Oxford at Nuffield College. And Duncan is, one of his claims to fame is he's being cited everywhere with the small worlds model, which we're going to ask him to explain during the discussion this evening. I was familiar with the small world theory in economics sociology. Then I became increasingly being given a signal that I need to move this up. I'm going to put it on my shirt. What's that? If I can get it on my shirt. There, how's that? Is that better? Okay. We'll do this. So, as I was saying, I'm familiar with the small world theory, and then I've had to do some reading on the small world model, which is a mathematization, an extension of this broader notion of small worlds. Very highly applied in everything from political science and other areas, the kind of thing that you'd find used by certain agencies in DC to understand how things cluster together, used throughout the social sciences and really yet to be used in economics, and just beginning to think about applying it in economics. For those of you who have heard statements being made by the Bank of England senior personnel, we're recognizing that we have limitations on our current forms of modes of thinking. So with that, I'm actually going to start out and ask Duncan to explain a little bit about the small world model.
Okay, so this is an idea that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, particularly these days in the age of social networking sites like Facebook. But for several decades, sociologists have been interested in this claim, which is called the small world problem, that hypothesizes that everybody in the world can be connected to everybody else through some short chain of intermediaries, so that you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows anybody else, any random person in the world. And the interesting thing about this claim is that it doesn't just apply to people who are like you, that come from the same sort of geographic area or education level or occupation, but that it also applies to people who are very distant from you in every respect. And so this is a claim that has sort of bounced back and forth between folklore and urban myth, and on the one hand, and social science on the other for several decades now. There was a very interesting experiment that was run back in the 1960s, conducted by the psychologist Stanley Milgram, who actually tried to test this hypothesis by giving a bunch of letters to people in Omaha, Nebraska, and the idea was to get the letters to a particular person in Boston, who was a stockbroker and an acquaintance of Milgram's. So these people were given all sorts of information about the stockbroker, plenty of information to identify him uniquely, but the catch was they could only send it to somebody they knew on a first name basis. So the chances being that they did not know the stockbroker, they had to send it to someone else they knew on a first name basis, who then sent it to one of their friends, who sent it to one of their friends. And the famous result was that of the letters that got to the stockbroker, which was roughly 20% of them, the average length of the chain was about 6. And this was very surprising to people back then. Milgram would, ask people, to predict how many steps it would take, and people would sort of estimate that it would take hundreds of steps. And so it was very counterintuitive that very distant people could connect each other in such a short distance. So this idea has, where I got involved with this back in the 1990s when I was doing my dissertation at Cornell in engineering, was to try to put some sort of mathematical foundations under this result, to ask sort of questions about the general conditions under which a very, very large network consisting of some millions or billions of individuals could have this property that, or actually two properties. The first one is that locally, people tend to know each other. So this is sort of a well-known property of social networks, that there's a lot of sort of local clustering, there's a lot of local similarity, and this argues against global connectivity. The world sort of feels to us as if we are kind of sort of segregated off into little kind of caves or clusters of people who are just like us, and they're all these sort of distant strangers who we're not connected to. And the question is, under what conditions can that be true, and it also be true that you can still reach everybody in some short number of steps? And so it turns out that actually not only is this possible, but it's also extremely likely to be true for many different kinds of networks, not just social networks, but also biological networks, networks of power generators, infrastructure networks, economic networks, organizational networks. And so this has sort of become a general class of mathematical networks that people have studied a lot over the last decade or so. And one of the reasons why you might care about this is because when it comes to questions other than this sort of little piece of folklore that's intriguing but not terribly applied to anything, right? Who really cares whether you can get a message to somebody in 6 steps or not? You never actually do that, right? But if you're interested in how epidemics spread, if you're interested in what happens when a novel strain of avian flu emerges somewhere in southern China, and the possibility that can explode into a global epidemic. If you're interested in the possibility that the failure of a single hedge fund, like long-term capital management in the late 1990s, could somehow propagate through a series of cascading failures through a network of financial institutions. If you're interested in problems like this, which of course we are interested in, then it might be important how the network is connected and whether it has this this property that everybody is in some sense close to everybody else, and what that means for the kind of policies that we might devise.
That's very important, because in a conversation I was having with Steve Leisman almost 2 years ago now, in the middle of the crisis, we kind of came to the conclusion that too big to fail is not necessarily about the absolute balance sheet size of a single entity. We came up with the notion of financial Facebook. Too big to fail is actually how connected or how interconnected a particular entity is. And so that means you look at a balance sheet and you may say, well, it's not very big. But when you look at how others may be dependent upon that balance sheet, who are then dependent upon others who are dependent on that balance sheet, the cascade or contagion effect through having a lot of interconnection, right, could result in fragility, right? To the extent that there is not some other redundant part of the system that can pick up the slack.
I don't want to dominate the conversation too much, but it's a very interesting analogy you make there, because when we're talking about too big or too interconnected to fail, our tendency is to focus on the attributes of an individual person or an individual institution and to ask what is it about that individual that makes them systemically risky. And I think that one of the things that we have learned over the years by studying the dynamics of things propagating on networks is that that may be a misleading way to think about risk. So let me just give you an analogy. If you go back to 2003, there was as you probably remember, there was a very large power failure in the Northeast. And it left New York City blacked out for about 24 hours. And you know, you asked if that was a huge event. It affected millions of people. And so you might think, okay, you know, what was the trigger for that event? That was sort of the analogy of the thing that was too big to fail. But of course, the trigger turns out to have been this completely innocuous power line in somewhere in Ohio, right? That was just, it was sort of one of a set of lines that were actually redundant with each other, right? And the sort of event that triggered this, the event that triggered this cascade is the kind of event that happens all the time, right? That power lines are always kind of hitting trees and shorting out, and they just go and fix them, and nothing, everything just kind of reroutes around it. Only this time, when the power rerouted around this particular failure, it generated another failure, which then caused a further kind of rerouting. It generated a whole bunch of oscillations, which caused some power stations to shut down because they exceeded their safety thresholds. And that caused other flows of power. And so at this point, the system has gone way beyond any sort of contingency that it was engineered to withstand. And then you get these sort of massive effects where you have huge surges flying back and forth between Michigan and Canada, and between Canada and New York, and then suddenly you've got hundreds of stations shutting down, and you have this massive event. And so this is very disturbing, because if you think about the analog in the financial world, it's absolutely unclear, how big or how interconnected something has to be to have this kind of impact on the system.
We're going to come back to that. Yes.
Yeah, the lesson I think in some of this is that, well, really we're all too interconnected to fail, and part of what we're learning is really, I think, a consequence of a wonderful graph that Andy Lowe showed when he opened up a conference last fall, and he was speaking about financial risk and about systemic risk. And the first chart he showed was the population graph of the last 200 years, and of course it just goes long, and then it goes straight up. And so we are all living in a world where we're all really very, very highly connected to each other, and there really isn't any other way to do it, since we're all, there's 9 billion of us, and about a third of those live very high off the hog, and we're going to be doing this presumably for a long time. So I think part of the lessons that we try to look at when we look at network dynamics, especially analogies from nature, is how are these things controlled? What appears to emerge from nature, of course nature has had several billion years to work out how to move energy through a cell, or how to grab photons from sunlight. And inside, there are all of these cell networks that we're starting to map out and understand. And we also have our own history. We have wonderful books about the Roman Empire. We have Cicero's wonderful quote about that you could just practically translate to one of Ronald Reagan's speeches. The empire is falling, people don't pay their debts, the government is going broke, and it's just all over again, right? But there are lessons that we learn. So one of the things that comes to mind when we're listening to this small world theory is that yes, we live in a small world. We're probably 1 or 2 hops away from the high value payment network of the world. Okay? And so we're part of the system that feeds money into and takes money out of systems that are probably just a couple of hops away from Chase's high-value payment system that goes straight to the Fed and then goes over to Tokyo or London or whatever they do. I don't really know what they do. So when you look at analogies from nature about controlling systems like this and about this analogy, the small worlds analogy, so how did they get the letter from Omaha to Boston? Well, they first tried to find someone who's really important that they knew, and then that person tries to find someone who's really important that they know. So we know a little bit about how to get somewhere really close. If I just gave it to my sister, well, she doesn't know anybody more than I know. So yeah, it'd probably take 100 hops if we just did the stupid thing. But you try to get to something that's really connected. And I think that's where the control, notion of controlling these networks, at least it doesn't tell you how to, but at least it tells you, well, where would I look? And in the small world theory, what you would look for is you look for the most highly connected person that you know, and then you give them the letter. In a similar way, when you are trying to control or think about controlling the power grid of the northeastern United States, using the small world analogy, you go and you look at the biggest junction that you know. You look at Niagara Falls. And when you're worried about financial risk and systemic risk, I think what you do, this isn't proven yet, but I think you look at the largest, the banks and the institutions that are sitting on the largest pipes that you know about, because they are the most connected. And it's not that they're too big to fail. Remember, we're all too big to fail. We're just too big to fail. Any one of us fails in Ohio, the little power line, it's going to knock a whole huge chunk out of the network.
To Alan's point, I remember having discussions at the Fed in 2006 when a eminent equity economist, chief economist at a major dealer, had a disagreement with me about the amount of fragility in the system. When I said the system was fragile, the amount of structural leverage was untenable and we were going to have an issue. His response to me was, are you talking about subprime? Subprime is a non-event.
Yeah.
They're less than 5% of the economy and they don't matter. This was a statement made in 06. By 07, he was quiet and contrite. Because he said, well, these are a bunch of folks, they're not central to the system. And he ended up eventually being pretty central, but central in a different way.
If I can just respond, you may well be right about financial systems, and in which case they're very different from social networks, because in social networks it's not. That is not how people solve the small world problem, which is a very interesting thing about social networks, because it's exactly how you would expect them to do that, right? So I mean, if you go back and read how, go back to Jane Jacobs or even earlier, that people sort of speculated about how this problem would be solved, and they speculated precisely along these lines, that you would choose the most important person, just as if you were flying in an airline network. The first thing you do is you get to the nearest hub, and then you hop from hub to hub, and then you hop back off again. And it's natural that we think the social world works this way, because that's how we design systems when we get to build them. And what's interesting about social networks is that they actually don't work that way, that they're very egalitarian. And this also makes sense when you think about it, because if you're trying to get a message to a stockbroker in Boston, what you actually care about is whether you know someone who lives in Boston, or if you know someone who has visited Boston, or who lives in the Northeast, or alternatively someone who is a stockbroker, or someone who works in the financial industry. And these people may not be the people who have the most friends, and they may not be very special in any kind of way. They just have a particular attribute that is relevant. And this may be very different from financial.
But it's not necessarily, and here's how I'm going to bridge both your views. Okay, it means you redefine how you're using the word from an operative perspective, important or influential. And you can have a situation where a relatively small player, okay, because of the amount of, much of the financial markets, particularly things like over-the-counter derivatives, are based on bilateral agreements. Okay, your debt I have a debt to you in one state of the world, you have a debt to me in another state of the world. We don't know who's the borrower or lender. Remember, neither a borrower nor lender B. Well, in this particular case, it's kind of a mix between neither a borrower or lender B and Heidegger's cat. Because I don't really know whether you owe me money or I owe you money until this next state of the world emerges. Now, if we've been trading among ourselves, okay, and we build up a set of obligations with each other that are contingent, and then the state of the world moves, you may actually find out that I owe you a whole bunch, but he owes me a whole bunch and you haven't traded with him yet. And so if I go down, you now have him owing you a bunch of stuff, but you may have been perfectly comfortable with my credit, but you may not love his credit, or vice versa. And so, in a way, what it does mean is from a dynamic perspective, the definition of importance is not the way that we tended to think about it, right? And now all of a sudden, the teeny tiny organism, may actually have a massive influence relative to a great big giant organism that usually everybody focuses on. So I think you're both right. It's just that it means that we end up in this much more complicated way of trying to define central roles.
I think, to put it another way, when we talk about centrality in a network or importance in a network, we have some sort of unstated theory about what's going on, right? So we think that people who know a lot of people are important, or people who have high social status are important. But that is sort of assuming that there's something happening to which those measures are relevant. And what we don't really have a good understanding of from a theoretical perspective is, how different kinds of processes play out on different kinds of networks, and then from that infer, what the relevant metrics are to look at. But just to come back to my earlier point, there may be no measure of an individual that is informative.
It may have to be a collective measure always.
The critical, what makes a network vulnerable or not vulnerable to a systemic event may actually be a property of some sort of distributed structure that exists within the network. And in fact, this is the sort of thing that we find.
That's why I'm a big fan of capacity games, and capacity games that form area of game theory, and also evolutionary game theory, which is about evolutionary stable equilibrium as opposed to just your typical Nash. How does some of what we've been talking about relate to some of the specific modeling that you've been doing, as much as you can tell us?
I began my career in finance from a slightly different direction than most people come into it. So I have a background in optimization, and so in particular kind of optimization under uncertainty. And so we get into things like risk measures and utility functions and maximizing and minimizing them. And I was when I first began my career at IBM, the people asked me to come down to Wall Street and give talks. And I gave talks, and people were very polite and everything, but they said, we don't do things this way. And so I said, well, how do you do things? You're dealing with risk all the time. And they said, well, we hedge. And so I became very curious about all of the mathematics behind hedging and trying to understand how I could fit it into my worldview. Which, when you work in mathematics, it's always very productive to try to put two different kind of thought things together, like you did with your work in Cornell. And so along the way, I developed, sort of a reasonable working model of what I was looking at, and in my comfortable framework of optimization. And certain things pop out. And one is that this notion of martingales and continuous dynamics, all of these sorts of things are very special. And I think that people who really do deeply know the subject, have a view that, well, we're just taking approximations of one sort or another. And so that always begs the question, well, approximations of what? And it's pretty clear that we don't have any kind of market that fits any of the assumptions that we use to trade derivatives, for example. And even very skilled shops, lose money on derivatives all the time when we know perfectly well that Black-Scholes is a perfect hedge. Well, it doesn't work that way in the real world, and I'm sure some of you, have been in shops where you can't just set up a Black-Scholes da-da-da-da and have it run off, and if the computer isn't running anything, you have to watch the damn thing. Excuse me. And so what's what becomes important? And you need a model to kind of tell you what might be important. And so one of the things that emerged out of the simple experiments that we were doing was, it mattered how much it cost you to do a transaction. That's a pretty clear thing, that it matters a lot. And the other thing is that it matters how much liquidity there is in the market. If you're going to set up a project to hedge a contingent claim of one sort or another, somebody has to either take the other side exactly, or you have to be able to trade with somebody pretty frequently in order to hedge this thing out. And so we look at these kinds of setups, and now, since I have a fairly simple model of how people might behave and I can use optimization. Optimization is very nice because it lets you explore things, explore a decision space or a control space in one way or another. And so we thought, well, why not start off with a whole bunch of agents that have various relationships to each other. Some of them could be agents in the economy who want to borrow money or invest in. We have a very simple economy. All they build is houses for each other, so it's a very simple economy. And then there's a whole other superstructure of people who want to buy and sell securities that are derived from the underlying securities. And they all have, set them up with different objectives and just let the thing run and see what happens. And what emerges, and people have done this work at Santa Fe as well. I'm not the only person doing this. There's a very famous group at Santa Fe and also with colleagues at MIT doing very similar kinds of things. What emerges is just bubbles emerge naturally. Bubbles just happen. Asset values get out of whack. They go up, they go down, people go broke. It just happens quite naturally. And there's nothing in the sort of general equilibrium theory that I was taught in college that would in any way lead rational actors to come up with bubbles. And so, again, coming back to my very practical notion of, from optimization, you begin to try to understand how to map these notions onto collections of real actors in the world and what their incentives might be. And David and I had a conversation along these lines, which led into a kind of another sort of small world example, which is, if I live in a big corporation, so I have another type of a similar analogy, but if you're working and you're trading with somebody, or you're depending on someone's work, or someone's a colleague of yours and you're depending on them, you tend to pay a lot of attention to them. And you become connected to them in some way. And as, of course, we become families, we become, and we evolve legal structures that allow us to cooperate in very, very strong ways. And so that's a way of a network coming in and saying, all right, so these people, these 300,000 people, that's IBM, and they're like a single entity. And, well, we're not. We're a bunch of things. But inside IBM is different than being outside IBM. And so there's some property of the network that's about allowing people to exchange freely inside. It's really an information network. Within IBM, the only difference between my conversation in this room and my conversation with an IBMer is that I can have a completely free flow of information. So it's an information boundary, effectively, is what a company is. So I think as there's a sort of a network kind of notion there, and what is that property of the network? Well, I think it's about information and what gets outside and what stays inside. And that's one aspect of it. And maybe we can explore that thought. I have another thought, which is about synchronicity. Go ahead.
Which is about
Well,
synchronicity.
when all collections of people do the same thing.
Right, and it's sometimes hard to tease synchronicity that occurs because everybody has an aha moment.
Right.
Or the information cascade papers in economics where, well, I just look to my right, and whatever the guy to my right is doing, I'm figuring maybe he knows something, so I just do what he does.
Right.
But if you think about information flow, okay, which, by the way, in classical economics and finance is Brownian in nature, which, by the way, in your small world, it seems to me that it wouldn't be Brownian necessarily, right? It might be Levy. It might be, it might have some other shape that's not going to look like, diffusion, right? And we know in nature we see jump diffusion, we see Levy distributions, we see power laws, and it just seems to me the small worlds view offers far broader alternative to just diffusion. The second thing, so there's the information flow concept, and then there's the action aspect. And what I would like to suggest, and see how you gentlemen respond, and we're going to find out how the audience responds to this as well, other participants. Interconnectivity and importance, as we're beginning to use an operative term of importance, would suggest that from a small world's perspective, from a clustering perspective, a network perspective, the way in which information propagates and the way in which actions affect players interact with each other, number one, and number two, so there are chains of obligations. Many of those obligations are contingent in nature, which means they depend upon a state of the world, and they depend on past actions as well, which means they're path dependent. And so imagine you've got a set of relationships.
Contracts.
Yeah, right. That's the contracts, the institutional contracts and various other kinds of contracts. And so now each player has built up a history of decisions. Those decisions are tied into decisions of other players. And the outcomes to those decisions are going to actually depend on whether it's raining or snowing, whether it's light or dark, whether, now they've got to make new sets of decisions based on their history. Because, the strict definitions in finance and economics is that past doesn't matter. You just work from your current state and go forward. And we know that in the real world, it's not generally the case, right? What you paid in the past and how much you own, anybody who's run a derivatives book knows you don't get to say, it doesn't matter what's in the book, we're just going to make this decision going forward, right? Even if you thought you could do that independently, your counterparties aren't going to let you. Right? So, unless you have infinite liquidity, so the way that the academic
But
literature...
the math trick is also infinite. You just keep piling things into the state.
You just keep piling things into the state. That's how we got into this mess, right? You just keep putting, oh wait, okay, I can't sell the position, I can't assign the position, I'm just going to flatten it out by putting another trade on, okay, over on top of that one, and it's not perfectly matching, it's close enough for now. And then the world moves a little bit, it's like, ooh, I just have now a big mismatch on this end. Oh, well, I better go flatten it out with something else. You're right, they keep piling it up. So, at that point, I'm going to stop talking, and it looks to me like you got something you'd like to add.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Andy Lowe is coming to talk next week because he was my postdoc advisor at MIT about
small world.
10 years ago or so, and
Yeah.
then I went from this Santa Fe Institute to work with him, and I had no experience working with I didn't know anything about financial markets, and he said that's okay, I'll teach you about financial markets, and we'll try to. This was just after long-term capital management had sort of gone to the brink of collapsing. And
What was your postdoc focus?
well, we were supposed to try to figure out this basically the question he was interested in, which I was also interested in, was, what would have happened if the Fed had let, or if the consortium of banks had let long-term capital management fail?
There's this the chain of
Like
indebtedness,
Right,
the chain of
so
obligation.
it's the experiment
Yeah,
that
right.
the Fed did run with Lehman Brothers, but did not run with long-term capital management.
Or Bear Stearns.
Right, so you can,
Yeah.
so what are the consequences of failure? And so we started thinking about this problem because at that time I had been doing some modeling of contagion on networks, and we thought it would be a relatively simple matter to map the kinds of models that I had been sort of physics-inspired percolation models on networks, epidemiological models on networks, to the case of financial systems. And the problem was that I actually started trying to read about finance, which was a mistake, I realized, because I quickly, or not quickly, but slowly over time, got more and more confused about what I was even supposed to be writing the model down about. So, if you want to think about it in the language of networks, it becomes very unclear what the network, which network matters.
Because actually, there kind of is no network.
There's lots of
And then so
networks.
everybody just throws out a bunch of networks, but nobody actually tries to reconcile.
So you have one, a possibility for contagion, which is this sort of, the kind of work that Don Farmer, I think you were referring to at SFI, and John Giannakopoulos and others have been working on, where you have hedge funds, for example, getting highly leveraged, and then some sort of shock leads to a margin call, which then forces them to sell into a falling market, and so you have these liquidity shocks. And that can then propagate because through the price system. Right? So the price system is has a way of coupling together different kinds of institutions, and that's a kind of network, right? It's a very particular kind of network, but it's a kind of network. But then you also have a different kind of network, which is between different assets in your portfolio, right? So I have, an unhealthy asset that I'm being forced to sell off.
Which I have been using as a hedge for another asset.
Right, so I have these other assets over here that are very healthy, but unfortunately the unhealthy asset I can't sell because its value just disappeared. So I need to raise capital to meet my margin call, so now I have to sell off my healthy assets. But now, maybe people will realize that this is happening, and so they take advantage of this, and so now I have the same problem with my healthy assets.
Right.
So that's a different kind of network through which shocks can propagate.
And it may even be stricter. I may actually have put those two together in a strategy and pledged one in order to buy the other, which then makes it an even tighter connection with the one you just mentioned.
So there's sort of an asset-to-asset network.
Yeah,
going on.
right.
And then you have an institutional network where we have counterparties on these trades, or we have, or a situation like the AIG situation where if AIG had just simply gone bankrupt, there would have been sort of huge outstanding debts to various counterparties that would have maybe lost $100 million or close to that, and so that would have been a sort of propagation of a shock through a set of through a network that's basically like loans.
Yes.
Right? So that would be a different kind of network. And then finally, maybe the sort of the most pernicious network of all is this sort of social learning network of you mentioned information cascades from the economics literature, where everybody's trying to form an opinion about the world, or an opinion about a particular thing, like should I trust this kind of asset class, should I trust Moody's ratings, and we can bring our own information to bear on these problems, but we also see what other people think. And if enough other people think that something has gone from being from good to bad, we may just simply adopt that judgment because it's not. It's easier for us to do that. So you get these sort of massive kind of collapses where everybody's sort of going along trusting in a particular that the world is working in a particular kind of way, and all of a sudden 2 days later nobody thinks that anymore. And that's a different kind of network again. And so you have all these things going on at the same time in financial systems, and it gets very sort of. This is the thing that has always sort of defeated me as a modeler. Like, where do you even start?
Now, are you ready to be really scared? Those are all different windows in on the same network. That's the interesting thing is that depending upon, I saw some heads nodding, this idea of I'm doing what's the guy to the left or right is doing, there's this one aspect, though maybe he has more information or different information from me, but the other aspect is what he's doing is going to affect my book, right? Which now ties into this kind of price thing. So I was sitting on a desk in the middle of the crisis, I won't say where, and was privy to a conversation, and one person says, I need a price on overnight repo for my $65 billion of investment grade 3-year corporate debt. And this guy gets back LIBOR plus 65. And there's this kind of like air getting sucked out of the room, the temperature drops, and this guy says, are you effing kidding me? He goes, that's more than these bonds pay right now. He goes, LIBOR plus 65. He says, well, I guess I'm dumping $65 billion of corporate bonds tonight. What's that going to do to your book? Phone click, call you back. 5 minutes later, we think we can come up with a better price, one that'll work for you. All right? And this was every single day. This went through this exercise every single day, and a lot of heads going up and down. People were right for a year at least, every single day. Right? So I think until we start to quantify these dynamics and model these dynamics, right? As these gentlemen are beginning to think about these dynamics and others are beginning to think about these dynamics, there's always going to be this kind of weakness in our understanding of economics and finance because there is this bridge that needs to be built between market externalities, as Ronald Coase described them in Chicago Economics, and network externalities as we're coming to understand them. And until we can embed structure into markets, institutional structure into markets, and social structure into markets and understand how those link up, we are actually ignoring a huge part of what drives adoption of actions, a huge part of what drives propagation of information, a huge part of what drives dissemination of beliefs, right? And the interrelationship between those three things. Because expectations can change, impacts or incentives around expectations can change, actions are tied to beliefs, actions are tied to information, how you process information may be affected by a set of actions. I mean, you can start to see how these things go back and forth. With that, I'm going to open it up to a set of questions. I see a couple of hands, 2 hands, and why don't we start, Faith?
I understand now from the first part what you three mean by network externalities, but I still don't get what are, for example, the 3 most popular classical multi-agent models, and what have we got that's new? And maybe that's too textbooky of a question, so you can change the question if you want, but I don't get the first part. What's multi-agent? Is that what David said? Those 4 windows are everybody's windows?
Sure.
Or is multi-agent a formal definition of something that I need to understand better?
I don't think there's a formal definition of it. There are a number of people who are working on multi-agent software with various kinds of properties in academia primarily. IBM is working on some to do things like traffic analysis in Tokyo and these kinds of things. I think the biology people are using multi-agent models to help with their cell systems analysis. And then there's a very strong effort in trying to understand how finance and the macroeconomic economy interconnect as a multi-agent network. The challenges are many in multi-agent modeling, and really in particular just getting data and initializing them to get them to even be even slightly interesting is a very, very difficult challenge. Now, just as a
Cleaning data or cleaning data?
both.
Now,
Yeah.
there's a single agent, okay?
Okay,
We
yeah.
study that all through economics, and there's a multi-agent,
Well,
there's a
here's-
network. How are they different?
Here are a couple of differences, Faith. the usual way of thinking about models in economics, as you know, is one of the things we do is we assume that information is generally available. Individual agents tend to be of a couple of types, okay? And they tend to have some private information, and then there's a bunch of public information, but the public information is accessible to everyone, okay? And when an agent reveals private information to the world, everybody gets to see it. It automatically becomes public, right? So there's this de-emphasis on any concept that agents interact locally with each other, or that information propagates locally. Information goes from being private to being public in a nanosecond, right? In less than a nanosecond. In agent-based modeling, there's much more of a focus on. The other thing about traditional models, by the way, is the structures are established. There's a bunch of exogenous things, and then there are a bunch of constraints, and then there are things that are endogenous, but very much it is this concept that, God comes in, he designs the universe like a clock, and then it works, okay? And then, every once in a while he comes by and he kind of tweaks some stuff, maybe or maybe not, but it kind of works. In the case of agent-based modeling, right, you set up, it's much more like an evolution. You set up, and give some characteristics to some agents, you allow them to evolve, you allow them to interact with each other. Information can be general, it can be local or private, right? When private information is communicated, it's usually communicated along some landscape that's developing as the model continues. They're a very different view than the view we typically have in economics and financial modeling, and that's what makes it agent-based. You may have some more to add on that.
So I would say that from a modeling perspective, there are two extremes that can be handled easily or more easily from an analytical perspective. If you're interested in sort of proving theorems or deriving results from analysis, the one extreme you have the single agent who sort of sits in an environment, and you can and the agent just interacts with the environment, and you solve that problem in isolation of anything else that might be going on. The other extreme is the sort of thing that physicists do, which is to assume an infinite number of agents. And so therefore, all the sort of internal or heterogeneity goes away, and you just write everything down in terms of averages, or what they call mean field theory, and then you just solve everything in terms of different systems of differential equations, right? And so we can sort of handle the kind of infinite n case, and we can handle the n equals 1 case. But of course, the real world is unfortunate middle ground where n is large but not infinite, right? And so the individuals still matter, right? So you have to have a representation of the individual and what the individual is thinking, or what kind of, makes some assumptions about their rationality, or what information they have, or what their utility function is, or whatever. But then there's lots of other individuals as well who you also have to represent. And then finally, you have to represent some way in which they interact with each other. And this is where the networks come in, right? Is that you want to specify that not all agents interact equally with all other agents, right? And some agents are bigger than others, and some are more connected than others. And so now you have this sort of tremendous complexity that you have just in the model, just in the specification of the model. And so now the usual kind of analytical tricks that you would like to use from economics or from physics simply don't work for any of these sorts of problems. And that's when the computational methods come in and things get very messy. So I'd say that's where agent-based models and networks come together, and it's a very large class of specific modeling techniques. Cellular automata is another kind of phrase that you might have heard of. It's the same kind of thing, it's an attempt to try to sort of grapple with this unfortunate reality that the world happens to sit precisely in the part of the modeling space that's difficult.
1, 2, 3, and then 4. When I was in Chicago, before we started, I came after being in real-world finance, and I would show them this problem. They go, "Oh, but you can't solve that. We don't want to do that. You can't solve that." Okay, and that's the challenge that we face. Is in the real world, we know we can't solve that. And oftentimes in traditional economics, they're like, "Oh, but," and other areas in science as well. You just, "But no, we want to. Let's come to something you can analytically solve." Otherwise, you're not making a prediction, right? Yes.
So, first of all, I work for the Federal Reserve, so I'll just explain that up front. I wanted to share about 5 or 6 observations I actually got in relation to your talk that might be relevant to you. First, you emphasized the differences in networks, and I think that's one of the things we're really struggling with. So it's real easy to think about the direct propagation network of contracts and counterparty exposures. The harder is the spillover effect, the Bruner-Meyer asset liquidation, which is not a direct observable network, it's more based upon who has what positions.
Mm-hmm.
I think the second thing to think about is, in some ways, the property of the network behaves very different depending upon the size of the shock. So I have a relatively small shock, I mark down my book, I provide observable price information. Well, some of that might get internalized because I may have hedge fund clients I'm providing prime brokerage to when it may be much more narrowly focused, and I may blow them out of the water. And so it may have a propagating, both an internalized effect where I have to take some counterparty losses, but also a propagating effect I don't inherently have seen up front. You talked about 3 types of networks, so essentially an asset network, a direct counterparty network, and the social information, what I'd call reputation risk network. There's a 4th that I think, and I think we have to think about connected networks, which is the funds provider network.
Yeah.
You know, we think about banks, but what really kicked this thing into overdrive was the collapse of the reserve primary fund. And that really was a massive accelerant on everything we experienced during the crisis.
The relationship between asset liquidity and funding liquidity.
Yeah. The other part, and I think this may be interesting since this is a liquidity risk event, is to think about a definition of liquidity. And the more I think about liquidity, liquidity is always and everywhere really just counterparty risk. It's my willingness to trade with you and provide you a price. And maybe that price is dependent upon having collateral or not, but ultimately it's my willingness to extend you credit, even if it's just settlement-based risk. And so market liquidity is actually just a function of the perceived fragility of the entire network. If nobody's willing to lend to each other, then you have no market liquidity, and that might be what we're seeing in Europe at the moment.
What in some very astute papers have been called collateral application mechanism.
Right. Just 2 more things I think that struck me to think about. One of the things that I think we got wrong going into the crisis, you read supervisors thought institutions were healthy, right? Well, we thought the slack capacity or whatever of each firm was sufficient, and I think what we had wrong was we misestimated that excess capacity. So asset volatility was actually higher than we predicted it would be. That made the entire network much more fragile, and that's why the initial collapse of liquidity in the fall of 2007 occurred, was because all of a sudden there was a realization that the totality of the network was less fragile than it was. Another point I observed is we have to think about, again, the different types of networks. So banks are one network, and they have actually access to backup liquidity. I can give them liquidity through discount window loans and everything I do. We had a large portion of the financial system that then relied on that regulated system to provide them with liquidity who weren't willing to do it. And I think there's something to really think about there of, even within the network, they have different abilities to act with one player. So a whole bunch of them were connected to me as the central bank and could get this market-based or this funding liquidity, and a whole bunch weren't. And that contributed, I think, to overall fragility that was out there. The last part I'd put about is, I think some of this might be useful in thinking about this, I hate the phrase too big to fail, but actually the size of firms. It strikes me that the more concentrated the financial sector is, the less, to use Duncan, your word, the less egalitarian and the less it has properties of a social network, and the more it has these sort of direct bilateral hardwired connections that may make it more fragile. And that's something I think I'm going to want to explore further.
And we're not even sure whether it's really about absolute size or whether it's about complexity. So when you have one institution or 2 or 3 institutions that do multiple functions in an economy, it might not be about the size of the balance sheet. It might be about conflicting functions being done by one organization.
The last point I would just say is, from a central banker perspective, the thing that's interesting to me then is what is the connection between this financial network and the real economy. And how do I think about that? So if I think about certain firms, somebody used the payment system analogy. Well, yeah, there's a very direct, tangible link to the real economy. If J.P. Morgan's money flow network goes down and Procter & Gamble, who's trying to move $500 million from Taiwan to Paris, all of a sudden that's all frozen up. That's a real tangible effect.
That's all very useful. I almost feel like we should put a 4th chair up here.
No.
Yeah, briefly. Yeah.
So there was your comment about the capacity is, I think, interesting. We have a tendency, I think, in the network science world to sort of think about engineering type solutions to problems. Like if only we could just map out the complete network of everyone connected to everyone else, and we had some model of how things are flowing, we could sort of tweak things and move wires around and stuff like that to make sure that bad things don't happen. And I suspect that may be a misleading metaphor, that in fact this is so complicated that we have no hope of really solving it in the way that we solve engineering style problems.
It's an ecology issue.
And so then we have to sort of maybe think about it in another way. And I'll come back to the power grid analogy, because the reason why we have these hugely distributed, multi-state power networks is a couple of reasons. First, that they actually, in some sense, are robust, right? In the old days, if your local power line went out, you lost power, right? And you have lots of local blackouts. And now it just gets rerouted somewhere else, and your power stays on. And so we have fewer blackouts now than we used to. The other thing that's great about these big power distribution networks is that they're very efficient, right? Because in the summertime I can be generating excess power in Washington State and pumping it to Southern California, where they've got their air conditioners on, and in the wintertime I have the reverse going on. And so I actually can get the same peak capacity, I can satisfy the same peak capacity demands with much lower overall capacity. And so the system has sort of evolved towards this sort of efficient frontier, right? The problem is that it's then susceptible to these very, very large cascades, right? And so I don't know if there's I don't know any formal results of this kind, but I suspect there is a result of the following kind, which is sort of you can't have everything sort of result, right? You can either have an efficient system that works really well most of the time, that occasionally explodes and does terrible things, or you can just sort of suck it up and have a lot of excess capacity, and that's your cost for avoiding these crises. So in the financial analog, you might say, well, we're just going to force banks to have a lot of excess capital, right? And that's going to drive down their profits, and they're not going to like it. And we don't really know how much we need to make them whole, but we'll just make it a lot, right? This is how civil engineers build bridges. They just they design everything and then they just double it, right? And then they hope that it stands up, right? So
it's like Moody's.
So there's I think that this is you're not going to really get to the sort of we can optimize this type solution in the engineering fashion. But there may be some sort of insight that just says, well, we can't have everything, so we're going to as a policy matter, err in the direction of caution, and people are going to be unhappy about that, but this is too bad.
Well, one thing I wonder about some of the fragility issues that you brought up is that during these sort of bubble episodes where everyone believes that collateral backed by subprime mortgages is fungible in some way. In a sense, what has happened is that people have discovered a new printing press, and 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 it relies on this a network of perceptions that this is going to be reasonable, that U.S. house prices are going to climb up into the stratosphere and so forth. Which was, at the time, I mean, when I was there, I was going back and forth between Europe and here, and you look at a house in Europe, and it's millions and millions of dollars. You look at a house in the United States, and it's $500,000. And you say, well, okay, yeah, maybe even valuations are okay, but there are some fundamentals involved, and I don't know how a central banker would judge these fundamentals in a reasonable way, but it seems that when so much paper is floating around that is almost of exactly the same type, and people are using it as collateral, then we're observing, I think Myron Scholes commented on this in a conference where I was sort of, that we're in a period of extremely low variance. We're in a period where there's very little investment going on, and there's sort of one game in town. And everybody's piling on to that one game. And I think it's the piling on part that gets me concerned. And another analogy is that this is a story my father always used to tell me when he was in the British Army, and they would build these very cheap little bridges that they were all supposed to go across. And the order to the troops was, don't march in time. Because if you march in time, then you set up these swings and you'll destroy the bridge. So this kind of resonance, or this sort of common view, common beat, or common resonance, or common notion of, gosh, we need to make an expected return of 6% this year. How are we going to do it? Well, how did David do it? Oh, well, David did it by investing in subprime. Oh, well, let's invest in subprime. And then the question then becomes, well, how do you see that happening? And I don't see any other way to see it other than to know what people are doing with their positions. How are they funding this stuff? And how are they generating these leveraged positions? You need to know.
Great. I think this gentleman here, well, let me ask a question. How many actually are questions, and how much, because I'm also looking at time. Are there actual questions? Questions, okay. A question? Why don't you ask your question?
Yeah, I guess actually just to make it as questioning as possible. Are you familiar with, and do you follow in any way the work of Carson and Doyle in the highly optimized policies? So, because when you talked about the power failures, I mean, I think of that as more of a highly optimized network than an affinity-based network, than a preferential affinity network.
This is the what they call robust yet fragile.
Yeah.
So the idea is that beyond a certain level of complexity, all systems have this robust yet fragile nature. So you sort of basically you engineer complex systems to withstand failure modes that you imagine, right? And therefore, by definition, the way they fail is in ways that you did not imagine, right? But they all have failure modes, right? But once the complexity of the system gets high enough, then this is inevitable. So the power grid example would be one example of this robust yet fragile nature.
What's nice is that they have, they make predictions about power laws for distributions.
Yeah.
And there's there are good measurements of power laws for returns.
I mean, of course, these models are very simple, and they're probably also going to not really describe the real world. But certainly, yes. I mean, so they, another nice example that John Doyle talks about is, the internet was designed, was engineered to be robust to physical attack, right? Which it is, right? It's just not very robust to spam, as it turns out. So, you
byproduct of exchange.
You really can't win. Yeah.
Okay. Question?
Yes.
Okay.
So what sort of modeling has been done for exchanges, looking at the advantages and disadvantages potentially of moving assets onto an exchange and thinking about what kind of assets would be good to have on an exchange.
That's a really good question. I wish I could say I knew the answer to that. I'm working with a colleague on a very simple model that looks at a queuing system approximation to understand, liquidity and movement of prices, sort of not the Black-Scholes world. There are a lot of experiments in exchanges going on. And as far as I know, the way they market themselves is have various attributes of certain types of matching that they can do. Speed, of course, very important. For most people, you want to disguise your buyer, you want to disguise yourself in some way. And I think this is a very fruitful area for research. It seems to me it'll be a combination of queuing systems. There's a lot of very, very good results in queues that under sort of one of these sort of math things, like we were saying before, there's sort of a low load and a heavy load. You can really model it using low load, heavy load kinds of things. What is really interesting is the connection between exchanges, like we've seen on a number of occasions, the 87 crash, and just the other week it seems to have been a multiple exchange kind of thing where people were bridging exchanges. And the people who do trade on multiple exchanges are forming a network of one sort or another, and it's a very, very interesting one. But I don't know what any, do you, David, do you know any really concrete studies, scientific studies about how exchanges behave?
Ooh, that's a complicated story. I mean, there's lots of stuff that's been done on exchanges. The real issue is just what fits on an exchange and what doesn't, right? In terms of a lot of when people really understand what it takes to hedge a OTC derivatives book, not going to get that on an exchange.
No.
No. And with that, the co-chair of the Liquidity Risk Committee, my co-chair, is here, and he had a question. So I've got to take your question, then we'll work our way back around.
I'll try to keep this a question. Following up on this, I think one of the questions, my question was going to be in some ways, and I preface it, much of this, the issues you guys were talking about networks and which network and all how they intertwine, in some ways that complexity is the issue that, if you take a look at it from a different direction, how do we streamline the system in a way, or what are the things that can go into this? Exchanges or clearing is an example of dealing with uncertainty in the system that people, or asymmetric information that has to be driving these kind of events.
Yeah.
What are the kind of things that we can be doing or that we should be thinking of that can make the system more robust, so that that again, you may always have these events, but in some sense, it's easier to adjust to them. It's easier to respond to them. What are the sources of fragility? You're studying on you're mentioning about how these bubbles would occur. What is the fragility that is most causing those kind of things to happen?
Well, there are differences in opinions, of course, and John Giancopoulos just wrote a wonderful paper, which I think is going to be a classic, where he has just 3 time periods, 2 different states of the world in each time period, 3 different classes of investors, and bang, now you've got a price bubble. Leverage is the key.
And the time dimension is going to be important in this too.
But I was thinking of just from an historical analogy, the exchanges that have been stable over a really long period of time listed people as liquidity suppliers. And I think in some of these other exchanges that you have now, I don't think there are any hard and fast rules about who supplies liquidity into the exchange.
It's interesting, though, if you follow
So you
the
said
small-
that they did list liquidity suppliers, those were the successful stable ones?
Yeah, like the New York Stock Exchange had specialists in their role. I mean, everybody here knows that. And that's what I think, in reading in some of the commentary from the Financial Times after the flash crash, people were pointing to people moving out of being a liquidity supplier, becoming liquidity demanders.
One thing you do have, again, the same issue on the exchanges relative to, terms from, it also provides price discovery, it provides clarification on counterparties, and small stocks trade on exchange, they don't necessarily trade with any liquidity, but the prices that the last trade was at. And there's information involved that, volumes, size of trades, and that provides information that I think is a potential source of some of the...
Provided you have homogeneity and standardization.
Yeah, and I've also heard one of my colleagues at IBM has got a bug in his ear about the Danish mortgage market, and because apparently in Denmark, and I don't know this to be for sure, but your market is on an exchange, and you can buy it back if it goes undervalued. So if your house is underwater, you can just buy back the mortgage at its discounted price, which is kind of a nice feature. Now, that doesn't prevent the Danish mortgage market from having bubbles, though.
Do you know who the largest provider of? Do you know who the largest provider of CDS protection on Danish mortgages was?
No.
AIG. Right? Interestingly enough, not one of those Danish mortgages had a single payment problem. Right? It was a mark-to-market issue.
But they still had a property bubble in the
It was a mark-to-market issue. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So which bubbled and crashed, type is collateral amplification mechanism. I want to work my way around this gentleman and then.
Okay. My question has to do with whether or not you've had any modeling that has extended the analogies that you've been bringing out today in terms of when we have liquidity, we think of fluid dynamics. We think of complex systems, we think of forced harmonic oscillators, as you mentioned, the bridge. I mean, it seems like even though in the fluid dynamics world it's so complex, but nevertheless we've been able to use it. I mean, similarly here, it would seem that if in fact it were written down in that kind of form, we might be able to get something that models for the world. Is any of that going on?
I think that there is a certain amount that's going on. I think that that it all has this problem that you can so one kind of model people write down is like just absurdly simple, sort of these the sort of thing that physicists write down in these sort of percolation style models, and they're sort of inspiring and illuminating in a very kind of qualitative way, but there's no way you can really extract any sort of prescriptive results from them, right? At the other extreme, you could sort of imagine this, kitchen sink model, as I would call it, where you just sort of throw everything into the model. And then you're basically back to where you started from, which is that if the model's now so complicated, you don't understand how it works either, right?
But in both cases, you can bring them to a point where you actually have them to the extremes, which is what we're looking for.
Well, what you would like is a model that's simple enough that you can understand how it works and you can learn things from it, and yet is realistic enough that it actually says something about the real world. And that, I think, in this particular case, is a very difficult exercise to pull off. And the reason is that in modeling, the situation you want is where one thing really matters, right? And so if you have like 6 things that really matter, then suddenly
they matter
you've got a
differently
very
depending on what's going on.
So I think this is the problem that we have with financial systems, and I certainly don't. I mean, I know of various models, but I don't know of anything that would satisfy that.
Think about a fluid dynamics problem where, sure, the properties of the fluid changes with a change in velocity, but the container shape is always changing, and the texture of the container, the surface in the container is always changing. And you're getting a little closer to what we have to deal with financial markets, right?
Yeah.
Because of updating and because of the change in contract structure, changes in institution, all other kinds of structure
It
changes.
very much
Well-
sounds like what they're doing with modeling the flow in cells today, actual.
I think there's a lot to be learned actually from the cell, and I was trying to set up a piece of joint work with some of the pharmaceutical companies who are studying these reaction flows inside cells. And it's like and the equations they use are called reaction diffusion equations. And you can get very, very interesting, strange behavior with reaction diffusions. But one thing I was going to just jump on the observation I was going to make on your point is that there are a lot of markets are markets. Markets have been markets for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And traders have gotten in trouble and they do things. And so I think on the trading floors and in the sell side banks, they probably have a pretty good idea of what's going on and how to manage it. Certainly, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, they have the best risk management systems around, and I say that because I walked around a little bit when I was selling things for IBM, and they did very well, and so they do know some things, and I think what they have is they have very, very good information systems for looking at positions and for understanding behavior, even, I think. So one of the things I think that's missing from the sort of more scientific or computer science side of things is that we just don't have the data. And I think we probably could get a lot of good observations for how people behave if you had a reasonable time series of a sell side bank, say, and just what they did and why and what was going through the industrial organization.
You need to flow into cells, so to speak.
In a similar sort of way, I mean, when the space shuttle, was it the Challenger, blew up? We crawled through NASA. We went through every single piece, every single decision made by every single bureaucrat, and we found out that they had a culture of one sort or another. And it seems to me we ought to crawl through one of these big banks and find out in a very similar way what are the cultural things that led them to take positions that they knew were outrageous. They just knew. They knew. Everyone did.
Would
It was
it have
just a
to be a
question
live
of the
bank, or
chairs.
could you take a dead bank like Lehman?
What's that?
It wouldn't have to be a live bank, or could you take a dead bank's information like Lehman?
Yeah, I think you
Could
could.
get that
But
from
Lehman was
Harding
such a mess. That it took $600 million just to figure out who owned what.
I mean, I was just going to say to that point, just read the Alcalist report on Lehman. I mean, there's a lot in there on that.
Yeah,
It's not fully forensic, but it's not pure data, but there's a lot on
There's a lot of
cultural
fun.
drivers and.
Last question.
Thank you. And by the way, thank you also not only for, this has really been very enlightening, because I'm a financial sector analyst. And with my experience in mergers and acquisitions as well as in counterparty credit risk, early on I was one of the analysts who they totally isolated and would not let me near the very issues that you've all been, because I worked at UBS in counterparty credit risk, analyzing UBS North American financial institutions counterparty. So my observations are questions such as, why do people think then, if the founders didn't think a banking cartel was something that we should accept in terms of like a central bank, why do we think that a banking cartel really serves our interests because of the abuse of power of this cartel? And the founders also did not allow agency to enjoy the abuse of power that we today are encountering. So, in speaking with regard to, or certainly to address how you're going to have those ring fencing or the break points that keep agency in check, and where something like a multi-agent model allows the cartel power of the financials to do things like get away with their barter, because the derivatives in that the triggering event is in effect you've got a lot of parasitism of cash flow, and when you've got depositors and or the voter's wallet, who then becomes the stopgap? It ultimately ends up where, except there be that right parental decision to say, we ring fence here, we stopgap here, agency, because when you listen to people like Bob Rubin testify to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, he and people like Greenspan said, well, we don't know when we're in the middle of what we're doing, what they're going to be the consequences of our decisions.
So your question is?
Well, my question is why where there how do you then build in what mitigates the power of the abuses of cartel, and should we consider, as voters and as taxpayers, because our wallet's been abused by this.
That's way out of scope for,
But I mean,
and way above our
about
pay grade.
systems. So how do you build within a system where you have something that turns around the management and says, we've got a break point.
You're raising very important questions about governance and incentives and
Actually,
so forth.
I can do an answer,
Okay, go
sort
ahead.
of an answer to that.
Right.
And, the banks like Goldman and JP Morgan manage traders, and they want their traders to go out and make money. And so these are very ambitious, very driven individuals. And what they do is they watch their positions really closely, and they look at them at an aggregate level, and they have a sense of risk for Goldman as an institution. And if risk starts building up too much in one area, they'll start applying an internal haircut to those positions in order to get them to back off of it. They're saying they're taking too much risk. And I don't see much difference between a corporation as large as Goldman or as large as IBM, for that matter, and a society. I mean, there are places where information collects and where and leadership, and the leadership sets the risk tolerances, and it tries to incent people to do the right things for the organization. And there are places within our regulatory system that we as a society have empowered to do certain things for us. And I think everyone in this community is taking a very hard look at how they performed and what they missed and what they could have done or should have done. And my view of this is that you have to take an experimental kind of evolutionary view of it. We make mistakes, we learn from them, and it's just a much larger body that is learning as we go. So in 1907, we decided we should have a Federal Reserve Bank, and we argued about it for another decade, and we got one, and then everything seemed to have fallen apart in the 30s, and it's all we need deposit insurance, and so we learn these things as we go. And I think we're in one of those learning periods right now.
I would say, okay, go ahead. I would say that that's a whole other wonderful conversation to have on maybe another liquidity risk night.
So I was listening to a talk by Lawrence Lessig recently, who's a great sort of intellectual property lawyer, and was talking about sort of the abuse of basically corruption in government as a result of money in politics, campaign finance. And he made this nice analogy where he said, you read these stories about people who get like a tiger as a kitten, and they keep it as a pet, and then the tiger grows up, and then it one day it just mauls them and kills them. And you don't blame the tiger, right? It's just in its nature to do that. And the same is true with bankers. You can't, in some sense, blame them, right? They're just doing what they're supposed to do, which is make as much money as they possibly can, and then get out before the risk explodes.
Are you saying that we should put bankers in the zoo?
So I think that's what Lawrence Lessig was saying.
So interesting final observation. There's a whole branch of economics called law and economics, and it has spent most of its growth history studying more product firms and less financial institutions. I think we're going to see a lot more work done in law and economics with regard to financial institutions. There's also a very interesting book by, I believe it is Dixit, called Lawlessness in Economics, where he's focusing on how does economics play out, and how does governance and things play out in a world where the rule of law does not necessarily pertain. And that doesn't just mean out in the middle of a jungle someplace, but it means in situations where, law is insufficient to manage exchange. What else steps in and how do other mechanisms work with that? And some of it's about information, disclosure, dissemination, enforcement, So the idea that some guy gets, okay, you're not getting what you need, I'll make sure you get what you need, but it's going to cost you. Right? I mean, so there's a whole lawlessness in economics. And then along those lines, Akerlof and Romer did an excellent paper that I recommend folks look up, and it actually looks at sort of notions of looting and institutionalized looting, and where do you have situations where there's expropriation between different parties, either within a market or within an institution, based on certain kinds of incentives, and can we make the mistake of creating a situation, okay, where it then turns out that it looked like looting, but it was just sort of rational behavior based on the way the game got set up.
Who wrote that, sorry?
Akerlof and Romer, R-O-M-E-R. Romer is someone who's currently in the administration, and Akerlof is won a Nobel Prize. And it's a fascinating, it was just written a few years ago. And so that's the homework takeaway. The end of the session is Akerlof and Romer, and Dixit's book, Lawlessness in Economics. And then there's one more interesting book by Diego Gambetta, and it's called The Economics of Organized Crime, where he actually looks at organized crime as if they were legitimate economic institutions, right? So you've got Dixit looking at legitimate economics when the rule of law is not sufficiently binding. And then you've got Diego Gambetta, who's done this fantastic edited book on, think about the mafia as just a corporation. Think about, and it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of how do incentives play out in different structures. If originally what you set out to do with VAR was eliminate risk from a balance sheet, and then that risk comes back to bite you in the butt because you thought you bought fire insurance on a house, but you got paid as if you sold the house, and then you find out, well, wait, the insurance company went down, now the house is burning. I still have the risk, but I paid the guy who bought my insurance as if he sold my house. There you go. And there you have it. And with that, we'll end. Thank you. Rain check, gentlemen.